The Last Lawman, Frank Hamer and the End of the Wild West. There's a photograph of Frank Hamer taken in the early 1920s that tells you everything you need to know about the man. He's standing ramrod straight in his Texas Ranger uniform, hat pulled low over eyes that have seen too much. His jaw is set in a way that suggests he's done talking, if he ever talked much to begin with. His right hand rests near his holster, not threatening exactly, but ready. Always ready. And if you look close enough at those eyes, you can see something that photographs can't quite capture. The knowledge that comes from surviving 52 gunfights, from being wounded 17 times, from being left for dead 4 separate times and somehow, impossibly, walking away each time. Francis Augustus Hamer was born on March 17, 1884, in Fairview, a small town in Wilson County, Texas, south of San Antonio. His father, Franklin Augustus Hamer, operated a blacksmith shop, one of those essential establishments in every frontier town where metal was shaped into horseshoes and wagon parts, and the tools that made life possible in a place still being carved from wilderness. The shop was hot, loud, filled with the ring of hammer on anvil and the hiss of red-hot metal meeting water. Young Frank learned the blacksmith trade the way boys learned everything back then, by watching, by trying, by making mistakes until you got it right. But the blacksmith shop didn't hold his interest the way it held his father's. Frank was one of 5 sons, and remarkably, 4 of them would eventually become Texas Rangers. Something in that Presbyterian household, something in the way they were raised, created men who looked at the lawless chaos of turn-of-the-century Texas and decided they needed to be part of the solution. Frank's mother, Lou Emma Frances Hamer, ran a devout household where hard work wasn't just expected, it was sacred. Where right and wrong weren't philosophical concepts to debate, but lines you didn't cross. The family moved to Oxford in Llano County in 1894 when Frank was 10. Oxford isn't much of anything now. It's a ghost town. One of those places where buildings collapse slowly under the Texas sun, and the only people who remember it are historians and descendants. But back then it was alive, a small community trying to make it in rugged country. Frank attended the rural school there through about the 6th grade, which was actually pretty standard for the time and place. What he lost in formal education, he made up for in the kind of learning that doesn't happen in classrooms. He trained himself to be an exceptional horseman. Not just competent, exceptional. The kind of rider who could track across rough country for days, who understood horses the way some men understand books. He also trained himself to shoot, spending hours with rifles and pistols until marksmanship became something more than skill. It became instinct. The kind of instinct that would later save his life more times than he could count. In 1900, when Frank was just 16 years old, he killed his first man. Not in some dramatic showdown, not as a lawman bringing a criminal to justice, but in an act of pure survival that would shape everything that came after. Frank and his younger brother Harrison were working as sharecroppers for a rancher named Dan McSwain. The arrangement should have been straightforward. Work the land, share the profits, build a life. But McSwain was the kind of man the frontier seemed to produce in unfortunate numbers. Violent, unstable, dangerous when crossed. McSwain approached Frank with an offer that revealed just how dark the man's soul was. He wanted Frank to kill someone for money. Murder for hire, plain and simple. Frank, barely more than a boy, but already possessing the moral clarity that would define his entire life, refused. He knew it was wrong. He wouldn't do it. And McSwain, realizing that the boy he'd just asked to commit murder could turn him into the authorities, made the kind of decision desperate men make. He shot Frank in the back with a shotgun. Think about that for a moment. 16 years old, shotgunned from behind by a man you trusted enough to work for. The blast should have killed him. Probably would have killed most people. But Frank Hamer, even at 16, was already demonstrating the kind of physical toughness that would become legendary. He survived. Recuperated. Slowly. Painfully. And then, when he was strong enough, he did what needed doing. He went back to that farm. He confronted Dan McSwain. And he killed him. This wasn't some Wild West quick-draw duel. This was a young man who'd been shot in the back, left to die, and who came back to make sure the man who'd tried to murder him couldn't do it to anyone else. It was vengeance, yes, but it was also justice in a place where formal law enforcement was thin on the ground. The authorities investigated, heard the story, and apparently decided that Frank Hamer had done exactly what needed doing. No charges were filed. The boy who'd killed to survive had just learned a hard lesson about the world. Sometimes the only thing standing between decent people and chaos is someone willing to cross that line. In 1901, Frank and his brother Harrison found work as wranglers on the ranch of Greenberry Ketchum Jr. near Sheffield in Pecos County. Now, this name might ring a bell if you know your outlaw history. Greenberry Ketchum was the brother of Tom Blackjack Ketchum, a notorious train robber who'd eventually be hanged in 1901. Working for the respectable brother of a famous outlaw gave young Frank an education in the thin line between the law-abiding and the lawless, between men who worked hard within society's rules and men who decided those rules didn't apply to them. Frank worked as a cowboy, learning the hard skills of working cattle in tough country. He wasn't just playing at being a cowhand. This was real work. The kind that carved lean muscle and burned your skin dark and taught you to read weather and terrain the way city folks read newspapers. In 1905, while working on the car ranch between Sheffield and Fort Stockton, something happened that would change the entire trajectory of his life. A horse thief was operating in the area. Horse theft wasn't like car theft today. It wasn't just property crime. In country where distances were measured in days of riding, where a man without a horse might die of thirst or exposure before reaching help, stealing a horse was potentially murder. It was taken seriously, very seriously. Frank helped capture the thief, demonstrating skills that went beyond just being good with a rope or fast with a gun. He showed an instinct for tracking, for anticipating where a criminal might go, for reading signs that others missed. The local sheriff, Dudley S. Barker, was impressed, deeply impressed. Here was a young man, only 21 years old, who combined physical capability with intelligence, who could track and shoot and think 3 moves ahead. Sheriff Barker did what good lawmen do when they recognize exceptional talent. He recommended Frank Hamer for the Texas Rangers. In April of 1906, Frank Hamer joined Captain John H. Rogers' Company C in Alpine, Texas, and became a Texas Ranger. He was 22 years old. The Texas Rangers in 1906 were still legendary, still operating in that transitional period between the old frontier and the modern era. They rode horses across vast territories, enforcing law in places where formal courts and jails were distant abstractions. They handled everything from cattle theft to murder to border troubles with Mexico. And they did it with minimal oversight, minimal resources, and maximal danger. Hamer's first 2 years were spent patrolling the Mexican border, which in those days was less a line on a map and more a suggestion that both sides ignored when convenient. He learned the territory, learned Spanish, learned to tell the difference between honest ranchers and smugglers, between refugees from revolution and revolutionaries themselves. It was an education in complexity, in the gray areas between right and wrong that books never prepared you for. In 1908, at the age of 24, Hamer resigned from the Rangers for the first time. He'd been offered a position as city marshal of Navasota, a boomtown about 70 miles from Houston that had a serious problem with lawlessness. Navasota was in the grip of an organization called the White Man's Union, a racist group that essentially ran the town through intimidation and violence. The previous marshal hadn't lasted long, either bought off or run off, depending on who was telling the story. Frank Hamer walked into that situation and did something remarkable. He brought order. Not through political maneuvering or careful negotiation, but through the simple application of courage backed by skill. He made it clear that the law applied to everyone, including the men who'd been treating Navasota as their personal fiefdom. He enforced his authority over the White Man's Union, which took either profound bravery or complete insanity, and probably both. During his time in Navasota, the town transformed. Shootouts on the main street, which had been killing people at an alarming rate, at least 100 dead in 2 years, slowed and then stopped. Not because people suddenly became civilized, but because Frank Hamer made it clear what would happen if you drew a gun in his town. He cleaned house, as the saying went, tamed the place. And he did it in the way he'd do everything for the next 40 years, by being tougher, smarter, and more willing to face down trouble than anyone else in sight. In 1911, he moved to Houston to work as a special investigator for Mayor Horace Baldwin Rice. Different work, but the same principles. Find the problem. Confront it directly. Don't back down. But Houston was temporary. The Rangers were calling him back. Or, more accurately, the border was calling him back. Because the border was exploding into violence that would mark one of the darkest chapters in Texas history. In 1915, Frank Hamer rejoined the Texas Rangers and was stationed along the Rio Grande. The Mexican Revolution was in full chaos, and that chaos was spilling across the border in the form of raids, smuggling, and violence. The period from 1910 to 1920 is known in history books as La Matanza, the slaughter, and it was exactly as brutal as the name suggests. This was a time of intense anti-Mexican violence, of extrajudicial killings, lynchings, and massacres. The Texas Rangers were at the center of it, and not always on the side the history books like to celebrate. They spearheaded operations against cross-border raids during what was called the Bandit War. But those operations often crossed the line from law enforcement into ethnic violence. Mexican Americans were killed, sometimes for crimes, sometimes for suspicion of crimes, sometimes for nothing more than being Mexican American in the wrong place at the wrong time. Frank Hamer operated in this environment. He participated in these operations. This is where we have to confront something uncomfortable. Frank Hamer was a man of his time, which means he held many of the racist views common to white Texans of the early 20th century. He was part of a system that terrorized Mexican American communities. He used violence liberally. justified it readily, and didn't always distinguish between bandits and civilians with the care we'd expect from law enforcement today. But here's where Hamer gets complicated, where he becomes more than just another racist lawman of the Jim Crow era. Because while he held prejudices common to his time and place, he also possessed something else. A fundamental sense that law had to apply equally, that mob violence was wrong regardless of who the mob was targeting, and that someone had to stand between the weak and the strong, even when it was unpopular. In 1917, at age 33, Hamer married Gladys Johnson Sims, a widow with 2 daughters. Gladys had been charged, along with her brother, with murdering her first husband, Ed Sims, though she was never convicted. Her past created enemies, particularly Ed Sims' relatives, who believed she'd gotten away with murder. That animosity would nearly cost Frank his life. On October 1st, 1917, Frank and Gladys and other family members stopped at a garage in Sweetwater to get gasoline. They encountered Gus McMeans, Ed Sims' brother-in-law and a former Texas Ranger himself. What happened next was a gunfight at point-blank range. 10 shots fired in seconds, 7 revolvers, 2 semi-automatic pistols, and 3 rifles recovered from the scene. When the smoke cleared, Gus McMeans lay dead with a bullet through his heart, and Frank Hamer was wounded, but alive. Again. Left for dead again. But not dead. After this, Hamer spent about a year as a federal agent in the Prohibition Unit in El Paso, right at the height of that city's reputation as one of the most dangerous places in America. El Paso during Prohibition was a powder keg of smuggling, violence, and corruption. Hamer participated in raids and shootouts, including one on March 21st, that resulted in the death of fellow Prohibition agent Ernest W. Walker. The details are sparse, but the incident gives you a sense of just how deadly routine operations could be. In 1921, Hamer transferred to Austin and was made senior ranger captain. He purchased a house in Austin that summer, and regardless of where his assignments took him after that, and they took him all over Texas, Austin remained his home for the rest of his life. It was the place he came back to, the anchor in a life spent chasing violence across one of the largest states in the Union. January 1st, 1922, marked the beginning of what biographer John Bosanecker considers possibly Hamer's most important work: his fight against the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK in the 1920s wasn't just a remnant of Reconstruction or a fringe hate group. It was experiencing a massive resurgence, fueled by post-World War I anxieties about immigration, racial change, and the erosion of traditional values. In Texas, the Klan had real political power. They influenced elections, intimidated communities, and operated with relative impunity because so many people, including law enforcement, either supported them or were too scared to oppose them. Frank Hamer opposed them. Publicly, forcefully, at great personal risk. In October of 1922, he and other rangers investigated the shooting death of Fred Roberts, a well-known citizen and Klan leader, in Corpus Christi. The case resulted in the arrest of the local sheriff, a deputy, a constable, and a farmer, though they were later acquitted. In November of that same year, Hamer led a team investigating Klan intimidation and violence against Tejanos and black residents in Breckenridge, Texas. Over the course of his career, Frank Hamer personally saved 15 people from lynch mobs. 15. That's not an estimate. That's a count compiled by his biographer from scout reports and newspaper accounts. 15 times, Frank Hamer stood between a mob baying for blood and a person, almost always African American, who the mob intended to kill. 15 times he put his body, his reputation, and his badge between vigilante justice and actual justice. Often he did it by threatening to shoot members of the mob. And by 1922, Frank Hamer's reputation was such that when he said he'd shoot you, you believed him. But there was one time he failed, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. In May of 1930, Hamer and a handful of Rangers were assigned to protect George Hughes, a black man accused of raping a white woman during his trial in Sherman, Texas. A mob estimated at 6,000 people. 6,000 descended on the courthouse. 6,000 people united in their determination to commit murder. Hamer shot and wounded 2 members of the mob. But the mob's response was to set fire to the courthouse. The building went up in flames. Hamer and the Rangers managed to escape, but they couldn't reach Hughes, who'd been locked in the vault for his safety. They had to flee, to regroup at the sheriff's office, to watch as the courthouse burned. Whether Hughes survived the fire isn't certain. What is certain is that the mob used dynamite to blast open the vault, and the next morning, Hughes's body was found hanging. The mob then went on to loot Sherman's Black District, and the Rangers were either unwilling or unable to stop them. It was a complete failure of law enforcement, of civilization itself. And Frank Hamer, who'd saved 15 people from mobs, had to live with the memory of the one man he couldn't save. Around this same time, in 1928, Hamer took on another powerful enemy, the Texas Bankers Association. The association had instituted a bounty system that paid $5,000 for dead bank robbers, not 1 cent for live ones, as the slogan went. On the surface, this might seem like a reasonable crime-fighting measure. In practice, it became what Hamer called the banker's murder machine. Corrupt police officers saw an opportunity. They'd hire someone to help them set up a fake bank robbery, then kill the patsy and collect the reward. Small-time criminals and innocent transients were being framed and murdered, so police could collect $5,000 per corpse. It was systematic, it was organized, and it was being tacitly approved by one of the most powerful institutions in Texas. Frank Hamer wrote a detailed expose of the racket. He didn't file it quietly through proper channels or wait for someone else to act. He took his article to the press room of the state capitol and handed out copies. Public outrage followed. Investigations were launched. Indictments came down. But the police refused to support Hamer's accusations, and the Bankers Association's position was essentially that anyone who could be induced to rob a bank deserved to die anyway. The bounty terms weren't modified. The murders continued. But Hamer had drawn a line. He'd made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate corruption, even when it was dressed up as crime fighting, even when powerful institutions were behind it. It didn't make him popular. It didn't win him friends in high places. But popularity and friendship weren't what drove Frank Hamer. In 1932, after nearly 27 years with the Rangers, Hamer retired Or more accurately, he was forced out, when Miriam "Ma" Ferguson was elected governor. Ma Ferguson was the wife of James "Pa" Ferguson, who'd been impeached and removed from office and banned from holding elected positions. So Ma ran in his place, openly campaigning that she'd be following her husband's advice, that she'd be a figurehead while Pa actually governed. Her administration was notoriously corrupt. She issued thousands of pardons, was soft on crime, and wanted to overhaul the Rangers. Possibly because the Rangers had been investigating corruption in her husband's previous administration. Hammer and many other Rangers resigned rather than work under her. He'd spent his career fighting corruption, intimidation, and mob rule. He wasn't about to enable it by staying on when the governor's office itself was the problem. His retirement lasted less than 2 years. In early 1934, Lee Simmons, administrator of the Texas prison system, came to Hammer with a proposal. 2 criminals, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, had been making Texas law enforcement look like fools for 2 years. They'd robbed banks, killed at least 9 police officers and 3 civilians. And most embarrassingly, they'd staged a prison break at Eastham Prison Farm in January of 1934. They'd killed a guard, freed several inmates, and humiliated the entire Texas Department of Corrections. Simmons wanted Frank Hammer to track them down and stop them. The pay was terrible, $180 a month. But Simmons promised a share of the reward money and the right to claim any of the gang's possessions upon their capture. More importantly, he was giving Hammer permission to do what needed doing, with minimal bureaucratic interference. Hammer agreed. He was commissioned as a Texas Highway Patrol officer and seconded to the prison system as a special investigator. On February 10, 1934, Frank Hammer, at age 49, began what would become the most famous manhunt in American history. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow weren't the romantic figures that Hollywood would later make them. They were stone-cold killers who'd murdered police officers in cold blood, who'd shot people for getting in their way, who left devastation wherever they went. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1934, they, or members of their gang, killed 2 Texas Highway Patrol officers, H.D. Murphy and Edward Bryant Wheeler, near Grapevine, Texas. The officers had stopped to offer assistance to what looked like motorists in trouble. They were shot down without warning. One eyewitness account, which received widespread coverage, claimed that Bonnie Parker had emptied her gun into the prone body of Patrolman Murphy. 5 days later, they killed Constable Calvin Campbell near Commerce, Oklahoma. Campbell was 60 years old, a widowed single father. The newspapers went wild with the story. Public sentiment, which had sometimes viewed Bonnie and Clyde as folk heroes who stole from banks during the Depression, turned hard against them. The pressure on law enforcement became enormous. Frank Hammer approached the hunt the way he approached everything, methodically, patiently, with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. He didn't chase Bonnie and Clyde in the traditional sense. He studied them. He gathered every scrap of information available: police reports, witness statements, crime scene evidence. He talked to everyone who'd encountered the gang. He built a profile of Clyde Barrow that was remarkably sophisticated for 1934. He determined that Barrow moved in a circular pattern, anchored by 3 cities: Dallas, Texas, Joplin, Missouri, and towns in northwest Louisiana. They'd expand outward from this circle to rob banks, then retreat back to familiar territory. They had a habit of staying close to state lines, exploiting the fact that law enforcement from one jurisdiction couldn't easily pursue them across state borders. They had favorite hotels, favorite back roads, favorite places to hide and rest. Hamer later said, "When I began to understand Clyde Barrow's mind, I felt that I was making progress." This wasn't just about knowing where Barrow was. It was about understanding how he thought, how he'd react in different situations, what his patterns and habits and fears were. Hamer wasn't chasing a criminal. He was hunting a specific human being whose psychology he'd learned to read. For 102 days, Frank Hamer shadowed Bonnie and Clyde. He lived out of his car. He was always a town or two behind them, following their trail, confirming his understanding of their patterns. He established contacts with law enforcement throughout the region. He worked with the FBI. He built a network of information sources. And he waited for the right opportunity. The opportunity came through Henry Methvin, a member of the Barrow gang who'd been freed during the Eastham prison break. Methvin's family, terrified by the violence and knowing that association with Bonnie and Clyde was a death sentence, reached out to Sheriff Henderson Jordan in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Through intermediaries, they made a deal. Henry's father, Ivy Methvin, would help set up Bonnie and Clyde in exchange for a pardon for Henry from the state of Texas. On May 21, 1934, the posse gathered. Frank Hamer, Maney Galt, a retired ranger who'd rejoined law enforcement and was now working for the Texas Highway Patrol, Bob Alcalcorn and Ted Hinton, both deputies from Dallas County Sheriff's Office, Sheriff Henderson Jordan and his deputy Prentice Oakley from Louisiana. 6 men, armed with automatic rifles, semi-automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols. They set up their ambush on a rural road near Gibbsland, Louisiana, Louisiana State Highway 154, heading towards Sales. The location was carefully chosen. The road was straight, offering a clear line of sight. It was the route Bonnie and Clyde would take when heading to the Methvin family home. And most importantly, it offered good cover in the bushes along the roadside where 6 men could hide with their weapons. Ivy Methvin parked his truck on the shoulder of the road and made it look like he was having engine trouble. The plan was simple. When Bonnie and Clyde came down the road and saw Methvin's truck, Clyde would slow down or stop to talk to him, and that's when the posse would make their move. The lawmen were in position by 9 p.m. on May 21st. They waited through the entire night. All of May 22nd passed with no sign of Bonnie and Clyde. They waited through another night. By the morning of May 23rd, after roughly 36 hours of hiding in the bushes, eating nothing, drinking little, they were tired, stiff, and beginning to think the intelligence had been wrong. At approximately 9:15 a.m., they heard a vehicle approaching at high speed. The sound grew louder. A 1934 Ford Deluxe V8 appeared, the same make and model Clyde Barrow was known to prefer. Clyde was driving. Bonnie was beside him. As the car approached Ivy Methvin's truck, it began to slow down. What happened next is disputed. Different members of the posse gave different accounts. Sheriff Jordan said he was calling out to Barrow to halt as the shooting started. Deputy Alcorn said Captain Hamer was calling out. Deputy Hinton wrote that Alcorn called out. But all 6 agreed on 2 things. Deputy Oakley stood and fired first, before anyone gave an order. And his opening shot from a Remington Model 8 rifle hit Clyde Barrow in the left temple, killing him instantly. Then everyone opened fire. 130 rounds in total, maybe more. The roar was so loud that people miles away thought a logging crew had used dynamite to fell a massive tree. The Ford V8, still moving forward, absorbed bullets like rain. The windows shattered. The body panels were punched through. Inside, Bonnie Parker screamed. And then the scream was cut short as bullets found her. The shooting lasted seconds, maybe 15 seconds, maybe 20. When it stopped, the silence was profound. The car rolled to a halt. Smoke drifted from multiple barrels. The 6 lawmen approached slowly, weapons still ready, because Bonnie and Clyde had survived ambushes before. They didn't survive this one. The car was a wreck. Metal shredded, glass everywhere, upholstery torn apart. And inside, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow sat dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. Combined, they'd been shot over 50 times. The violence was shocking even to men who'd seen violence their whole careers. Hamer would later tell reporters that under different circumstances he would have gotten sick seeing a woman's body that perforated. But he didn't get sick, because he remembered the murders they'd committed, the police officers they'd killed, the terror they'd spread. The posse called for a tow truck. The Ford, with the bodies still inside, was towed to the Conga Furniture Store and Funeral Parlor in downtown Arcadia, Louisiana. This was common. Furniture stores often shared space with undertakers. Preliminary embalming was done in a small preparation room in the back. And then something remarkable happened. Word spread. The population of Arcadia, normally about 2,000 people, swelled to 12,000 within hours. People arrived by train, by car, on horseback, even by plane. They wanted to see the death car. They wanted to see the bodies of Bonnie and Clyde. Beer that normally sold for 15 cents jumped to 25 cents. Sandwiches sold out. It was a circus, macabre and American, and telling about what people wanted from their outlaws. Not justice, exactly, but spectacle. Henry Barrow, Clyde's father, came to identify his son's body. He sat in a rocking chair in the furniture section of the store and wept. Just a father who'd lost his son, regardless of what that son had done. The promised reward money never materialized. Or rather, it did, but in a fraction of what had been pledged. Various sources had promised a total of about $26,000, a fortune in 1934, but most reneged. When the dust settled, each posse member received exactly $200.23. They were allowed to take some of the guns and belongings from the car. Hamer took most of the weapons. Frank Hamer had ended the most famous crime spree of the Depression era. He'd tracked Bonnie and Clyde for 102 days, studied them, understood them, and when the moment came, he'd been exactly where he needed to be. Congress awarded him a special citation. Newspapers across the country covered the ambush. He became, briefly, a national figure. And he hated it. Hated the attention, the interviews, the hero worship. He didn't attend the Hamer Galt Hero Day celebration in Austin. He refused most interview requests about the Bonnie and Clyde investigation. To Frank Hamer, this wasn't his greatest achievement. It was just another job, another case of tracking down criminals and stopping them. The fact that it had captured the public imagination didn't make it more important than the 15 people he'd saved from lynch mobs, or the fight against the KKK, or the decades of less glamorous work keeping the peace in a state that was still, in many ways, finding its way out of the frontier. After the Bonnie and Clyde case, Hammer worked for various oil companies and shippers, generally as a strikebreaker. This is another uncomfortable part of his legacy, using his skills and reputation to break up labor organizing, often violently. He saw it as maintaining order, enforcing contracts, protecting property. Labor organizers saw it as union busting on behalf of the powerful against the powerless. Both things were true. In 1939, at the outbreak of war in Europe, 55-year-old Frank Hammer and 49 other retired Texas Rangers offered their services to King George VI to help protect the United Kingdom in case of Nazi invasion. The king didn't take them up on the offer, which is probably just as well. 50 aging Texas Rangers, however tough, weren't going to turn the tide against the Wehrmacht. But the offer tells you something about how these men saw themselves. As defenders against chaos, willing to go wherever chaos threatened. In 1948, Hammer emerged for one final legendary moment. Texas Senate hopeful Coke Stevenson enlisted his help investigating voter fraud in Jim Wells and Duval counties. Stevenson was running against Lyndon B. Johnson in the Democratic primary runoff. And in Texas, in 1948, winning the Democratic primary meant winning the seat, so this was effectively the real election. The race was razor thin. Johnson won by 87 votes out of nearly 1 million cast. But when Hammer investigated the returns in those two South Texas counties, he found names listed in different colored ink. Names of people who were dead, missing, or who claimed they'd never voted. The names were listed in alphabetical order, as if someone had gone through a phone book. It was systematic fraud, conducted by Johnson's political machine. Hammer proved it. Stevenson challenged the results in court, but Johnson had powerful allies, including Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, and the challenge failed. Johnson went on to win the general election, became senator, then vice president, then president. And Lyndon Johnson never admitted that the 1948 runoff had been stolen, though historians generally agree that it was. Frank Hammer retired fully in 1949, at age 65. He'd spent more than 40 years in law enforcement. He'd fought in 52 gunfights, been wounded 17 times, left for dead 4 times. He'd saved 15 people from lynch mobs. He'd fought the Ku Klux Klan when it was dangerous to do so. He'd exposed corruption in banking and police departments. He'd tracked down the most famous criminals of his era. He'd stood between chaos and civilization in a time and place where that line was constantly shifting. In 1953, he suffered a heat stroke. He never fully recovered. On July 10, 1955, he died in his sleep from congestive heart failure at his home in Austin. He was 71 years old. He was buried in Austin Memorial Park Cemetery, only a few spaces away from his longtime partner, Manny Gault. At his funeral, Texas Rangers chaplain Pierre Bernard Hill said that Hammer was a man who feared Almighty God, but never feared the face of any man. It's a good epitaph. Accurate. Frank Hammer lived his entire life without backing down from anyone. Not outlaws, not lynch mobs, not the Ku Klux Klan, not powerful bankers, not corrupt politicians. He had a code, and he followed it even when it cost him, even when it was unpopular, even when it put him in danger. Was he perfect? No. He was a man of his time, with his time's prejudices and blind spots. He used violence readily, perhaps too readily for our modern sensibilities. He participated in events during La Matanza that we'd now recognize as ethnic violence. He worked as a union buster, using his reputation to intimidate workers trying to organize. His legacy is complicated. But here's what's not complicated. For 40 years, Frank Hamer stood on the front line between law and lawlessness. He did it when law enforcement meant riding alone across empty country with a badge and a gun and nothing else. He did it when violence was personal and close range and terrifying. He saved people who couldn't save themselves. He opposed powerful forces when opposition was dangerous. And he never, in 52 gunfights over 4 decades, backed down from a threat. In 1967, the movie Bonnie and Clyde portrayed Hamer as an incompetent buffoon who was captured and humiliated by the outlaw couple, and who only killed them out of personal revenge. It was a complete fabrication. Hamer never encountered Bonnie and Clyde before the ambush, never saw them until they were dead. The movie's portrayal was so defamatory that Hamer's widow Gladys and son Frank Jr. sued Warner Brothers and won an undisclosed settlement. In 2019, a more accurate portrayal appeared in the Netflix film The Highwaymen, with Kevin Costner playing Hamer. That version got closer to the truth. An aging lawman called out of retirement, using old-school methods and relentless determination to track down criminals who'd made fools of modern law enforcement. The legacy Frank Hamer left behind is complex and deeply American. He represents a type of lawman that couldn't exist today. Someone who operated with vast personal authority, who made life and death decisions in moments, who enforced law in places where law was barely more than an agreement among armed men about what behavior was acceptable. Modern policing, with its accountability measures and oversight and internal affairs investigations, emerged partly in response to the excesses of men like Hamer. That's both necessary and sad, because what we gained in accountability, we sometimes lost in effectiveness. There's a photograph, not the one from the beginning of this story, but another one taken later in Hamer's life, that captures something essential about the man. He's older, his face lined deeply, his eyes tired in a way that goes beyond physical exhaustion. He's wearing civilian clothes, no badge visible, no gun in sight. But his posture is still straight, his gaze still direct. And if you didn't know who he was, you'd still feel, looking at that photograph, that this was someone you didn't cross. Someone who'd seen things, done things, survived things that would have broken lesser men. Frank Hamer lived through the transformation of Texas from frontier to modern state. He was born when Geronimo was still raiding across the Southwest, when the last buffalo herds were being slaughtered, when large parts of Texas were still genuinely wild. He died in the Atomic Age, in a Texas with highways and suburbs and television sets. He bridged those two worlds, the world of horse thieves and bank robbers who shot it out with lawmen, and the world of organized crime and forensic science and interstate cooperation. The skills that made him legendary, the ability to track, to shoot, to survive in harsh country, to face down threats without flinching. Those were frontier skills. But he applied them with a modern sensibility, or at least his version of one. He investigated crimes systematically. He gathered intelligence. He built profiles of criminals. He worked across jurisdictions. The methods were sometimes brutal, but they were also sophisticated in ways that pointed toward modern law enforcement. His fight against the Ku Klux Klan stands as perhaps his most important work, even though it's less famous than the Bonnie and Clyde manhunt. In the 1920s, opposing the Klan in Texas took real courage. This wasn't some fringe group. The Klan had political power, social influence, and thousands of members. They held parades in major cities. They endorsed political candidates. They operated with impunity in many communities. Frank Hamer stood against them anyway. Not because he was free from racial prejudice, he wasn't, but because he believed in law, and lynch mobs represented the opposite of law. They represented chaos, the rule of the strong over the weak, the triumph of fear over justice. Every time Hamer stood between a mob and their intended victim, he was making a statement about what kind of society Texas would be. He was drawing a line and daring people to cross it. Those 15 people he saved, we don't know all their names. Some are recorded in scout reports and newspaper accounts. Others are lost to history. But each one represents a moment when Frank Hamer looked at a crowd of people united in their intention to commit murder. People who believed they had community support, who believed they were enforcing a kind of rough justice. And he said no. He stood there with a gun and a badge and an iron will and said, "Not today. Not while I'm breathing. You're not killing this person." Think about the courage that took. These weren't professional criminals he was facing. They were townspeople, neighbors, people who went to church on Sunday and ran businesses and raised families. People who, under the right circumstances, would form a mob and hang someone. And Hamer had to threaten to shoot them, had to make it clear he'd kill them if they tried to push past him, knowing that some of them were people he knew, people whose kids went to school with his kids, people he might see at the general store next week. The Sherman Courthouse burning haunted him because it represented his limits. 6,000 people. Even Frank Hamer, with his reputation and his skill and his absolute willingness to use deadly force, couldn't stand against 6,000 people. The math just didn't work. And George Hughes died because the mob was too big, too determined, too willing to burn down a courthouse to get what they wanted. What do you do with that failure if you're Frank Hamer? If you're a man who's built a life around standing between victims and violence, who's saved 15 people through sheer force of will, how do you process the one you couldn't save? The records don't tell us. Hamer wasn't the type to talk about his feelings, to process trauma through conversation. He just carried it, the way he carried everything else, as weight that made him who he was. The confrontation with Dan McSwain when Hamer was 16 set the template for everything that followed. Someone shot him in the back. He survived. He came back stronger. He made sure the person who'd tried to kill him couldn't do it again. That pattern, survive, endure, come back, prevail, repeated itself across 52 gunfights and 17 wounds, and 4 times left for dead. Other men might have taken those close calls as signs to find safer work. Hamer took them as confirmation that he was hard to kill, that he had work to do, that someone needed to stand in the dangerous places. His relationship with violence was complicated. He wasn't a sadist who enjoyed hurting people, but he was absolutely willing to use violence when he deemed it necessary. And his definition of necessary was broader than modern standards would allow. He shot people who drew on him, obviously. But he also shot people who were fleeing, people who were resisting arrest, people who represented threats that hadn't yet materialized. In the context of his time and place, this was often considered acceptable. In our context, much of it would be criminal. The Bonnie and Clyde ambush exemplifies this tension. 130 bullets into a car with 2 people. Both of them shot over 50 times. No warning given, or at least not enough warning for them to respond. No attempt at arrest. Just overwhelming, devastating violence designed to eliminate the threat completely. Harmer did say, that Bonnie and Clyde had killed too many people, that they'd made it clear they'd never surrender, that attempting to arrest them would have resulted in more deaths. And all of that was probably true. They were cop killers who demonstrated repeatedly that they'd shoot their way out of any encounter. But the ambush was still an execution, carefully planned and efficiently carried out. We can argue about whether it was necessary, whether it was justified, whether Harmer and the posse had other options. What we can't argue is that it was anything other than what it was. 6 lawmen deliberately killing 2 people who had no chance to defend themselves or surrender. Does that make Harmer a hero or a killer? The honest answer is both. He was a hero who killed people. He killed people who needed killing, in the context and morality of his time. He also killed people, and killing people is a heavy thing, regardless of justification. The modern tendency is to want our heroes pure, our villains clearly marked. Frank Harmer resists that categorization. He's too complicated, too much a product of a specific time and place, too willing to do things we're uncomfortable with. His decades of work between the spectacular cases, the routine patrols, the investigations that didn't make headlines, the daily grinding work of law enforcement in a huge state with limited resources. That's where the real measure of the man lives. Anyone can be brave for 15 minutes during a shootout. Harmer was brave, or at least willing to face danger, for 40 years. Day after day, month after month, decade after decade. Riding out into country where help was hours away, confronting people who'd kill him if they could, enforcing laws that weren't always popular. The relationship between Frank Harmer and Texas is almost mythological. He embodied something Texans wanted to believe about themselves: that they were tough, self-reliant, capable of handling their own problems without help from distant authorities, that they had men who could stand alone against chaos, that the wild frontier spirit hadn't been completely tamed by civilization. This mythology glosses over the uncomfortable parts, the ethnic violence he participated in, the strike-breaking, the willingness to use violence as a first resort rather than a last one, the prejudices and blind spots. But myths always gloss over the uncomfortable parts. That's what makes them myths rather than history. The true story of Frank Harmer, the one that includes both his courage and his flaws, his heroism and his brutality, his service and his prejudices, is more interesting than the myth. It's the story of a man trying to bring order to a chaotic world, using the only tools he knew: force, determination, and an absolute unwillingness to back down. Sometimes those tools were appropriate, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes Harmer was the hero the situation needed. Sometimes he was part of the problem. What's undeniable is his effectiveness. For 40 years, Frank Harmer made a difference in Texas law enforcement. Criminals feared him. Communities that hired him saw crime drop. Problems that seemed unsolvable got solved when Harmer was assigned to them. Whether his methods were right by modern standards is almost beside the point. They worked by the standards of his time. in the context where he operated. His death in 1955 marked the end of an era, in more ways than one. The old-style Texas Ranger, answering primarily to his own conscience, operating with vast personal authority, settling problems with a gun more often than with paperwork, was already becoming obsolete. Modern law enforcement was emerging, with its emphasis on procedure, oversight, and accountability. The wild spaces Hamer had patrolled his entire life were getting smaller, more civilized, less in need of men who could survive alone in harsh country. But for a specific moment in American history, Frank Hamer was exactly what was needed. A man hard enough to survive the violence, skilled enough to prevail in it, and dedicated enough to keep showing up day after day. A man who'd been shot in the back at 16 and came back from it. Who'd been wounded 17 times and kept going. Who'd been left for dead 4 times and refused to stay dead. The Texas Rangers that exist today are different from the organization Hamer served. They're more professional, more accountable, more diverse. They use forensics and computers and interstate databases. They work within systems of oversight that Hamer would have found stifling. And they're better for it in most ways. Better trained, better supervised, less likely to abuse their authority. But ask any modern Texas Ranger about Frank Hamer, and you'll see something in their eyes. Respect, certainly. Maybe a little awe. The understanding that what Hamer did, surviving 52 gunfights, tracking Bonnie and Clyde for 102 days, standing down lynch mobs, fighting the Klan, represented a kind of law enforcement that required capabilities and courage they're grateful they don't need in the same way. Frank Hamer's story is Texas history. It's American history. It's the story of the transition from frontier to modern era, from personal authority to institutional systems, from rough justice to due process. He stood at that intersection, 1 foot in each world, trying to bring order to chaos using tools that were already becoming obsolete even as he wielded them. And in the end, maybe that's the most important thing about Frank Hamer. He was the last of something. The last lawman who could patrol alone for weeks. The last ranger who settled more problems with his gun than his paperwork. The last connection to a Texas that was still wild enough to need men willing to ride into that wilderness and impose order by sheer force of will. That Texas is gone now. The wilderness is fenced and settled. The outlaws rob banks with computers instead of guns. The Rangers work cases with forensic evidence and legal procedures. And that's progress. That's civilization winning over chaos, which is what we wanted. But something was lost, too. The certainty that when chaos threatened, there were men like Frank Hamer who'd stand against it without hesitation, without doubt, without fear. Men who'd been tested in ways most of us can't imagine and passed those tests again and again and again. Frank Hamer died in his sleep at home in Austin, Texas on July 10, 1955. He was 71 years old. He'd lived long enough to see the world he'd known disappear, replaced by something safer and softer, and less in need of men like him. He'd lived long enough to become a legend, a symbol, a reminder of a rougher time. And he'd lived long enough, just barely, to see Bonnie and Clyde transformed by Hollywood into romantic figures, which must have galled him, because he knew what they really were. He'd seen the bodies they left behind. He'd tracked them for 102 days, studying their patterns, learning their habits, understanding their cruelty. When he met them on that Louisiana road on May 23, 1934, and 130 rounds ended their crime spree in seconds, Frank Hamer was doing what he'd always done, standing between civilization and chaos, using violence to stop violence, ending threats before they could threaten anyone else. Was it justice? By the standards of 1934 Texas, absolutely. By our standards, that's a harder question. But Frank Hamer didn't have the luxury of difficult questions. He had situations that needed resolving and the tools to resolve them, and he did what he thought needed doing. For 40 years, through 52 gunfights, 17 wounds, 4 times left for dead, 15 people saved from lynch mobs, 102 days tracking the most famous criminals of his era. A lifetime spent standing in dangerous places because someone had to stand there. That was Frank Hamer. Not perfect, not always right, but absolutely, completely, relentlessly unwilling to let chaos win. And in a time and place where chaos had every advantage, that made all the difference. If this story of one lawman's lifetime standing against chaos resonated with you, hit that like button. And if you want more deep dives into the lives of people who shaped history through sheer determination and courage, subscribe to Cold Tales. We'll keep bringing you the stories of individuals who refused to back down when everything depended on standing firm. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.